The year was 1959, a time of unprecedented scientific optimism fueled by the International Geophysical Year. In the heart of the world's most hostile continent, Antarctica, a small outpost named Station Polaris stood as a monument to human curiosity. It was a cluster of prefabricated huts anchored against unimaginable winds, more isolated than any vessel at sea. Here, 8 brilliant minds, led by the esteemed geologist Dr. Alistair Thorne, sought to unlock the planet's deepest secrets. Station Polaris was more than a research base. It was a symbol of progress in a world divided by the Cold War. Positioned in the pole of inaccessibility, the point on the continent farthest from any ocean, its very existence was a triumph of engineering and willpower. The men who lived there were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of knowledge at the very edge of the world, their work broadcast as a beacon of international cooperation and daring exploration. At the helm was Dr. Alistair Thorne, a man whose passion for geology was matched only by his unwavering idealism. He believed science was a universal language that could unite nations. He saw the Antarctic ice sheet not as a barren wasteland, but as a pristine library containing the history of the Earth, and he was determined to read its volumes for the benefit of all mankind. His leadership was defined by a calm authority and an infectious sense of wonder. The crew was a hand-picked collection of specialists, each a leader in his field. They were meteorologists, glaciologists, and engineers, bound together by a shared mission and the claustrophobic reality of their environment. For months they endured the perpetual darkness of the polar winter, their only connection to the outside world a high-frequency radio. In that crushing isolation, camaraderie was as essential as oxygen, but tensions, like hairline fractures in ice, were beginning to form beneath the surface. Their mission was ambitious, to drill ice cores deeper than ever before and chart the unknown geology beneath the ice. The data they collected was considered invaluable, offering insights into past climates and the very composition of the planet. They were on the cusp of discoveries that could reshape humanity's understanding of its world. The stakes were immense, and every member of the Polaris I-Team was acutely aware that they were making history with every sample they retrieved. On December 4, 1959, the world received its final garbled message from Station Polaris. The transmission was broken by static, a frantic voice barely intelligible over what sounded like a hurricane-force gale. The few decipherable words were vortex, unprecedented, and station compromised. Then there was only silence. The signal died, and with it, all contact with the 8 men at the bottom of the world was severed, leaving only a chilling echo of their final moments. The official report, compiled weeks later, was grim and definitive. Based on the fragmented transmission and meteorological data, authorities concluded that Station Polaris had been struck by a polar vortex of unimaginable ferocity. It was a freak weather event, a sudden and violent act of nature that no structure could have withstood. The narrative was simple, tragic, and universally accepted. The station and its crew had been utterly obliterated, swallowed by the ice without a trace. They were declared heroes, martyrs to the noble cause of scientific discovery. Their names were etched onto memorials, their story becoming a cautionary tale of the unforgiving power of the Antarctic. Dr. Alistair Thorne and his team were immortalized as brave explorers who paid the ultimate price in their quest for knowledge. Their loss was mourned globally, a celebrated tragedy that solidified the continent's reputation as the last untamable frontier on Earth, a place that jealously guarded its secrets. The official timeline painted a picture of a routine day descending into chaos. The morning radio check-in on December 3rd had been perfectly normal. Dr. Thorne reported clear skies and excellent progress on the deep core drilling project. He spoke of the team's high morale and their anticipation of a breakthrough. There was no hint of danger, no mention of an approaching storm, nothing to suggest that it would be the last clear communication the world would ever receive from them. In the hours leading up to the final transmission, the men would have been following their strict schedules. Scientific readings, equipment maintenance, and communal meals punctuated the long, monotonous days. The omniscient quiet of the Antarctic plateau would have been broken only by the hum of the generator and the crunch of boots on snow. It was a world of stark, beautiful, and deceptive tranquility, a calm before a storm that no one supposedly saw coming. The search and rescue operations launched in the following weeks were the most extensive in Antarctic history. Aircraft crisscrossed the desolate landscape, their crews scanning the endless expanse of white for any sign of wreckage, any splash of color that did not belong. They found nothing. The ice sheet was a blank canvas, showing no evidence that Station Polaris, or the men who inhabited it, had ever existed. The continent had seemingly erased them from existence entirely. The absence of any debris was perhaps the most unsettling part. Experts argued that the force of the vortex would have scattered wreckage for miles, yet not a single twisted piece of metal or tattered scrap of fabric was ever recovered. The official explanation was that the station was buried instantly under dozens of feet of new snow, entombed so deeply and completely that it would remain lost forever. This lack of physical evidence left a void that speculation could not fill. After months of fruitless searching, the mission was officially called off. The 8 men were declared dead, their fate sealed by the consensus of the scientific and international communities. The case was closed, not by evidence, but by its complete absence. Nature, it was said, had been the judge, jury, and executioner, leaving no crime scene to investigate. The world accepted the verdict, and the story of the Polaris Bust expedition passed from current events into the pages of history. For the families left behind, the official story offered little comfort. They were left with a grief sharpened by the agony of uncertainty. With no bodies to bury and no final answers, their mourning became a permanent state of being. They were handed medals and condolences, their loved ones lionized in public ceremonies, but in private they were haunted by the specter of the unknown, a wound that refused to close with the passing of the years. Alistair Thorne's family was particularly devastated. His wife and young child were left to navigate a world that celebrated a man whose final moments were a mystery. They were custodians of a heroic legacy built on a foundation of unanswered questions. As the years turned into decades, the official narrative of a tragic accident began to feel hollow, a simplistic explanation for a loss that felt profoundly and unnervingly incomplete. They sensed something was wrong, a missing piece that no one else seemed to notice. This quiet, persistent doubt lingered in the shadows of the official account. How could a team of expert meteorologists be caught so completely off guard by a storm? Why was there no earlier warning, no attempt to evacuate or secure the station? These were questions whispered among the families, dismissed by officials as the understandable grasping of grieving relatives. The story of a freak storm was too clean, too convenient, and it left no room for human error or any other darker possibilities. Over time, the legend of the Polaris expedition became an unassailable fact. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and a new generation of scientists was inspired by their sacrifice. The men of Polaris became mythological figures, their tragic end a foundational story in the annals of modern exploration. Their disappearance was a testament to the perils of the unknown, a reminder that for all of humanity's ambition, the natural world always held the final decisive power. The great Antarctic ice sheet served as the perfect accomplice to this narrative. It is a place that buries history under pressure and time, its slow, inexorable movement erasing all evidence. For 50 years, it held the secret of Station Polaris in its frozen embrace, a silent, impassive guardian of the truth. The station, and the story of what truly happened there, lay dormant under miles of accumulated snow and ice, a time capsule waiting for the world to change around it. But ice is not permanent. It flows, it cracks, and it yields to the slow, warming breath of a changing planet. What it buries, it can also reveal. The story accepted by the world was based on the assumption that the station was gone forever. No one considered that the crime scene itself was not destroyed, but perfectly preserved, flash frozen at the exact moment of the tragedy, waiting for a future generation to uncover its chilling tableau. The world had accepted their heroic sacrifice, a noble loss in the face of nature's overwhelming power. The official report was a closed book, its conclusions taught as fact for half a century. But what if the greatest threat to the men of Station Polaris was not the storm raging outside their fragile shelter, but the quiet, calculated ambition that was raging within its walls? 50 years passed. The world that had mourned the Polaris during expedition transformed beyond recognition, while the station itself remained locked in a stasis of absolute cold. In 2009, the planet was a different entity, warmer and more closely watched. Satellites that sliced through the upper atmosphere, charting the Earth's changing topography, noticed something impossible. A vast section of the Antarctic ice shelf, previously stable for millennia, had calved away, revealing a subglacial landscape unseen by human eyes. An anomaly, a perfect geometric shape, appeared on thermal imaging scans deep within the pole of inaccessibility. A new international research initiative was quickly assembled to investigate the anomaly, a mission of opportunity born from the planet's shifting climate. At the head of the glaciology team was Dr. Eris Thorne, a woman whose entire life had been shaped by the continent she now studied. She was brilliant, driven, and the granddaughter of Alistair Thorne. For her, this was more than a scientific expedition. It was a pilgrimage to the site of her family's defining tragedy, a place that existed for her only in black and white photographs and heroic, hollow stories. Aris carried the weight of her grandfather's legacy like a research pack, both a source of inspiration and a constant, heavy burden. She had dedicated her career to understanding the ice, perhaps as a way of understanding the force that had allegedly claimed him. She never fully accepted the official narrative of the freak storm. It was too simple, too neat a conclusion for a man as meticulous as her grandfather. Now, standing on the same continent that took him, she felt an unnerving sense of proximity to a past she had only ever imagined. The approach to the anomaly was slow and deliberate. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the impossible. The object buried beneath 60 feet of compacted snow was not a natural rock formation. It was a structure, metallic and man-made, its dimensions matching the archived blueprints of Station Polaris exactly. A wave of disbelief and electric anticipation surged through the team. The station that was supposed to have been obliterated, scattered across the ice by a vortex, was sitting intact, waiting in the silent darkness beneath their feet. The excavation was a painstaking process, a delicate archaeological dig into the recent past. As powerful thermal drills melted away the layers of time, the station's roof gradually emerged from its icy tomb, its paint still a faint, defiant red against the stark white. The moment the team breached the main hatch and the frigid air of 1959 rushed out to meet them, they knew they had stepped out of the present and into a ghost story. The air was stale, still holding the faint scents of brewed coffee and engine oil. What they found inside defied 50 years of accepted history. Station Polaris was not a scene of violent destruction. It was a place of eerie, profound stillness. In the common area, a chessboard sat on a table, pieces frozen mid-game. A half-empty mug of coffee rested beside it, a thin film of ice coating its contents. Coats were hung neatly on pegs by the door, as if their owners had merely stepped outside for a moment and intended to return. This was not a tomb ravaged by nature. It was a crime scene. The official report had spoken of a cataclysm, of winds powerful enough to tear steel apart and bury a compound in seconds. But here there were no shattered windows, no collapsed support beams, no sign of any structural damage whatsoever. A book lay open on a bunk, its page held by a pair of reading glasses. In the communications room, the radio equipment was damaged, but not from an external force. The delicate wiring appeared to have been deliberately and methodically severed from the inside. For the rest of the team, it was a mind-bending scientific puzzle. For Eris, it was a deeply personal and horrifying revelation. The story that had defined her family was a lie. The men of Polaris had not been victims of a storm. The tranquility of the scene suggested something far more sinister. They had simply vanished from a perfectly secure environment. The station wasn't compromised by a vortex. It had been silenced by something or someone within its own walls. Driven by a sudden, desperate urgency, Eris made her way to the small, cramped space designated as her grandfather's personal quarters. The room was just as he had left it. Geological charts were pinned to the wall, his fountain pen resting beside an open notebook filled with his precise, elegant script. She felt like an intruder, a voyeur stepping into the final private moments of a man she had only ever known as a legend. Her professional detachment dissolved, replaced by the raw ache of a granddaughter searching for her lost family. Beneath his bunk was a standard-issue Expedition footlocker. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, his personal effects were neatly arranged. Spare wool socks, a collection of letters from her grandmother, and several scientific journals. On top of everything lay his field logbook. She opened it to the last entry. The neat handwriting of the earlier pages gave way to a frantic, almost illegible scrawl, detailing mounting tensions with his second-in-command, Dr. Elias Vance, over a new discovery. The final pages were a confusing jumble of geological data and personal observations. Her grandfather wrote of Vance's dangerous ambition and his insistence on secrecy. The numbers in the log seemed to be coded, pointing to coordinates that didn't match the expedition's official survey area. It was a map, she realized, but to what? She didn't know. The last coherent sentence was a chilling premonition. Vance believes this discovery is worth more than our lives. I fear he may be right. The official story had no room for such conflict. Eris ran her fingers along the inside of the footlocker, feeling for anything out of place. Her knuckles brushed against a slight unevenness in the metal bottom. Prying at it with the tip of a geological hammer, she revealed a shallow, hidden compartment. The official narrative, the heroic myth, died in that moment. It was not a storm, not an accident. It was a betrayal, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed by a man who had been hailed as a hero for half a century. Inside the compartment lay a small lead-lined box, heavy and cold to the touch. It was designed to protect its contents from magnetic interference, a precaution for preserving sensitive data recordings. Eris's heart hammered against her ribs. This was something her grandfather had hidden, something he did not want found by the wrong people. This was his final message, a time capsule of truth sent across a 50-year void, intended for someone who would question the official story. She carefully lifted the box out. Affixed to the lid was a small, typewritten label, the ink faded but perfectly clear. It was addressed to her, a person who had not yet been born when the words were typed. It read, "For Eris, if you find this, do not trust the story. Do not trust Vance. The truth is in the numbers. Polaris is silent." The words were a ghostly whisper from the past, a direct warning from her grandfather. Opening the box, she found not a diary, but a single tightly wound reel of audio wire, the recording medium of the era. It was his final irrefutable testimony. The theory of a tragic accident evaporated in the frigid air of the station. It was replaced by the chilling certainty of a crime. This was not a historical site to be documented. It was an active investigation, and her grandfather had just handed her the primary piece of evidence. The silence of Polaris was about to be broken. The discovery transformed Eris's mission. She was no longer just a scientist studying the past. She was the custodian of its darkest secret. The men of the Polaris expedition were not martyrs to science. They were victims. The implications were staggering, pointing to a conspiracy and cover-up that had held for 5 decades, orchestrated by a man the world celebrated. Her personal quest for answers had just become a public hunt for a killer. The intact station was the first piece of damning evidence, a silent witness that screamed foul play. The logbook was the motive, hinting at a discovery so monumental it was worth killing for. And the audio reel in her hand was the weapon that could finally bring the truth to light. It was a ghost's testimony, a voice waiting to accuse its murderer from beyond the grave. Eris Thorne now held the key to unlocking a 50-year-old lie. She knew she could not handle this alone. The moment she transmitted her findings, she would be setting in motion a chain of events that would rewrite history and destroy the reputation of a scientific icon. The forces that had benefited from the silence for half a century would not give up their secrets easily. She was standing in a perfectly preserved crime scene, holding the confession of a murderer, and the world had no idea. The other members of her team looked at the station with scientific awe, marveling at the preservation. They saw a historical treasure. Eris saw a tomb. She saw the ghosts of 8 men, including the grandfather she never knew, their final moments erased and replaced with a convenient and heroic fiction. She had a duty not just to science, but to them. Her resolve hardened into cold, unshakable certainty. The world believed Dr. Elias Vance was the sole tragic survivor of a natural disaster, a man who had miraculously cheated death. He had built a legendary career on that story, accepting awards and accolades for his bravery while his colleagues lay frozen in an unmarked grave. Eris now understood the chilling truth. Vance had not survived a storm. He had orchestrated a massacre and walked away, leaving nothing but silence behind him. The weight of the lead-lined box in her hands felt immense. It contained not just a recording, but justice. It was the voice of the dead, a final, desperate attempt to be heard. The mystery of the Polaris expedition was no longer about what had happened to the 8 men who vanished. It was now about what one man had done to them, and why the world had been so quick to believe his lie. But unearthing the station was only the beginning. This discovery was the first piece of a macabre puzzle that had been frozen in time, and the man who held the missing pieces was still very much alive. The journey from the frozen heart of Antarctica to the sterile quiet of a forensic audio lab in Christchurch, New Zealand, was fraught with a tension that felt almost physical. The audio reel, nestled in its lead-lined box, was no longer a mere artifact. It was a ghost, demanding to be heard. Eris Thorne watched as technicians, with the delicate precision of surgeons, threaded the fragile wire onto a custom-built playback machine. They were not just restoring a recording, they were resurrecting a voice, carefully coaxing a 50-year-old whisper back from the brink of oblivion, a process that felt both sacred and profoundly invasive. The air in the soundproofed room was thick with anticipation as the first distorted sounds crackled to life. It was a symphony of static, the hiss of time itself obscuring the human drama locked within. Using advanced spectral analysis and noise-filtering algorithms, the audio engineers began to peel back the layers of decay. They isolated frequencies, canceled out the ambient hum of the long-dead station generator, and painstakingly stitched together fragmented waveforms. For Eris, every moment of progress was agonizing, bringing her closer to a truth she both craved and dreaded. Finally, after days of meticulous work, a voice emerged from the static, clear and unmistakable. It was her grandfather, Alistair Thorne. His tone was firm, laced with an academic's frustration, debating geological data points with a second man. Then the other voice, sharper and colder, cut through. It was Elias Vance, his words dripping with a chilling ambition that defied the passage of half a century. The conversation wasn't about a storm or equipment failure. It was a heated argument about ownership, about destiny, and about the immense value of something they had found deep beneath the ice. The recording culminated in a moment that froze the blood. Alistair's voice, now filled with alarm, accused Vance of betraying their mission for personal gain. Vance's reply was not a defense, but a confession, a calm, horrifying statement of intent. "This discovery will define the next century, Alistair," his voice echoed from the past. "History has no room for idealists." The recording ended abruptly with the sound of a heavy object striking something solid, a brief, desperate struggle, and then a profound and final silence. The official story of the Polaris Mars expedition did not just crack, it was atomized. The National Science Foundation, faced with undeniable acoustic evidence of a crime, was forced to reclassify the case. The heroic legend of a team lost to nature was formally rescinded, replaced by the grim reality of a 50-year-old homicide investigation. Aris, once a historical researcher, was now the key witness in a murder that had been perfectly concealed by time, ice, and a carefully constructed lie. An NSF special investigator, a pragmatic and deeply skeptical man named Marcus Cole, was assigned to the case. Cole's first action was to pull the complete unredacted debriefing transcripts of Elias Vance from 1960. He read the account of a young, traumatized scientist who had miraculously survived a polar vortex of unprecedented power. Vance's testimony was filled with vivid, heroic details: the sudden pressure drop, the shrieking winds that tore the anemometer from its mast, the communications array being ripped away, and his desperate lone fight for survival as the station was buried around him. He painted a picture of nature's fury, an act of God that left no room for human agency. How, Cole wondered, could a story so detailed be a complete fabrication? He commissioned a team of historical climatologists to run advanced atmospheric models, inputting all known meteorological data from the Antarctic plateau for December 1959. Using computational power unimaginable at the time, they recreated the weather patterns for the exact week of the disappearance. The results were unequivocal and damning. There was no polar vortex. There wasn't even a significant storm. The weather at Station Polaris had been, according to the models, almost unnervingly calm. The foundation of Vance's 50-year narrative was a lie. This single, critical fact changed the entire lens of the investigation. Every statement he had ever made was now suspect, every detail of his celebrated survival story a potential piece of a larger deception. If there was no storm, then the destruction of the communications equipment was not an act of nature, but an act of sabotage. The question was no longer what happened to the Polaris team, but how Elias Vance had managed to convince the world of a cataclysm that never occurred. The investigation then turned to Vance's miraculous rescue. According to his debriefing, he had been found adrift on an ice floe by a passing Norwegian whaling vessel, barely alive. But a deep dive into maritime archives revealed something else. The ship, the Hafitbjörn, was not a whaler. It was a privately chartered vessel, owned by a Panamanian shell corporation, and its logs showed it had been holding a fixed position just outside the Antarctic Treaty Zone for 3 weeks prior to the rescue, a highly unusual and expensive endeavor with no stated purpose. Aris and Cole followed the money, a task made difficult by decades of corporate obfuscation, but the digital breadcrumbs, faint as they were, eventually led them to a single source, a powerful and secretive energy conglomerate, Titan Energy Corp. In 1959, the company was a nascent player in the global market, but in the years following the Polaris incident, it saw a meteoric rise, fueled by a series of uncanny successes in acquiring mineral rights. The connection was tenuous, but tantalizing. Did Vance have partners in his deception from the very beginning? The focus shifted back to the science, to the discovery Alistair Thorne had deemed worth more than their lives. Eris returned to her grandfather's logbook, to the frantic final entries and the coded geological notations. The numbers, which had seemed like random data points, were in fact coordinates. But when she cross-referenced them with the official survey maps of the expedition, the versions published by Elias Vance in his later celebrated academic papers, they didn't align. Vance's published data was subtly but significantly altered. Using modern geological imaging software, Eris plotted her grandfather's original coordinates. The program rendered a three-dimensional model of the bedrock beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, revealing a geological anomaly of staggering proportions. It was a subterranean dome, a natural trap containing what the model projected to be the largest and purest deposit of helium-3 on the planet. This was the discovery. An isotope with the potential to fuel clean nuclear fusion, it was a resource that could rewrite the global balance of power and make its owners wealthier than nations. Vance hadn't just stolen the credit for the discovery, he had buried it. By falsifying the coordinates in his official reports, he had moved the location of the deposit on paper by several hundred kilometers, rendering it lost to any subsequent survey. He had created a treasure map to which only he and his corporate benefactors held the key, allowing them 5 decades to secure the political and logistical framework needed for its eventual exploitation. The motive was no longer just ambition. It was a conspiracy of unimaginable scale and patience. The pieces were locking into place. Vance didn't survive a storm. He orchestrated a massacre. He didn't get lucky with a rescue. He was extracted by his partners. He didn't honor his colleagues' legacy. He desecrated it by hiding their monumental discovery for his own enrichment. The heroic survivor was, in fact, a meticulous and ruthless killer who had played the long game with absolute precision, hiding his crime behind a wall of scientific prestige and public adoration. It was time to confront the legend himself. Dr. Elias Vance, now in his late 80s, lived in a stately home overlooking the Puget Sound. He was a titan of science, a recipient of countless awards, a man whose public persona was one of gentle wisdom and quiet, tragic authority. He was a living monument, and Eris and investigator Cole were about to try and tear that monument down with a 50-year-old echo on a wire. They found him in his library, surrounded by books and accolades, a frail figure with eyes that still held a sharp, calculating intelligence. He greeted them with a practiced, weary warmth, the elder statesman indulging a curious historian and a government functionary. He spoke of Alistair Thorne with deep, rehearsed reverence, calling him a mentor and a friend whose loss he still mourned every day. His performance was flawless, honed by half a century of repetition. Cole began by questioning the storm. He presented the new climatological data, the models showing a period of calm. "We're having trouble reconciling your account with the meteorological records, Dr. Vance," Cole stated, his tone neutral. For the first time, a flicker of something other than gentle reminiscence appeared in Vance's eyes. It was annoyance, the irritation of a king whose word was being questioned. He dismissed the data as modern hubris, claiming models couldn't capture the freak-localized nature of polar weather. Then Eris presented her grandfather's logbook, open to the page with the real coordinates. She laid the printout from her geological software next to it, showing the helium-3 deposit. "This is what you found, isn't it?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "This is why they had to die." Vance's composure fractured. He stared at the charts, his face paling. the carefully maintained mask of a tragic hero beginning to slip. He called her claims preposterous, the fantasies of a granddaughter unable to accept a simple, tragic truth. But his denial was too quick, his anger too sharp. The cracks were showing. He had built his life on a foundation of absolute control over the narrative, and for the first time, someone was challenging it with evidence he thought was buried forever under miles of ice. He was a man who had outrun his crime for 50 years, only to find it waiting for him in his own library. If the storm was a lie, what else was? This rhetorical question hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. If his core alibi was false, then every action he took in the aftermath became an act of concealment. The sabotaged radio, the fabricated distress call, the prearranged rescue, each element was a calculated step in a monstrous plan. He had not only killed 8 men, he had erased their true history. The interview ended with Vance ordering them out of his house, his voice shaking with a rage he could no longer conceal. The frail old man had vanished, replaced by the cold, ruthless figure from the audio recording. Eris and Cole left, knowing they had him, but they also knew the challenge ahead. Vance was insulated by wealth, power, and a public image that was nearly unassailable. His denial, however weak, would be amplified by a legion of supporters. They possessed the truth, recorded on a fragile strand of wire and corroborated by scientific data. But Vance's greatest defense was the world's unwillingness to believe that one of its heroes was a monster. A court of law would be a battlefield of technicalities where his high-priced lawyers could cast doubt on the authenticity of a 50-year-old recording. They needed more than just evidence to convict him. They needed to destroy his legacy in a way that was public, irrefutable, and absolute. How do you prove a murder when the chief architect of the crime has spent a lifetime convincing the world he was its greatest victim? The answer was not in a courtroom, but in a forum where reputation and truth would collide with spectacular force. They had the weapon, the voice of Alistair Thorne accusing his killer from beyond the grave. Now all they needed was to build the perfect stage for it to be heard. The investigation had reconstructed the crime, revealing the cold mechanics of a conspiracy. It had exposed the motive, a discovery so vast it was worth a massacre. It had unmasked the villain, a celebrated icon of science and exploration. Every piece of the puzzle was on the table, forming a chilling mosaic of greed and betrayal that had been hidden from view for half a century. Aris now understood the full weight of the label on her grandfather's hidden box. Polaris is silent. He hadn't been referring to a broken radio. He was referring to the silence of his murdered colleagues, a silence Vance had ruthlessly enforced for 50 years. Her mission was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about ending that silence once and for all. Back in her hotel room, Aris looked at the file they had built. It contained meteorological models, maritime records, corporate ownership charts, and geological surveys. It was a mountain of technical data that all pointed to one man. But the heart of it all remained that short, chilling audio file. It was the ghost in the machine, the undeniable proof that could cut through any legal defense. She thought of Elias Vance, cornered and exposed, his life's work of deception unraveling. An animal is most dangerous when it is trapped, and Vance was a man who had proven he would do anything to protect his secret. The threat was no longer buried in the past. It was alive, powerful, and aware that they were coming for him. The methodical process of investigation was over. The quiet academic work of piecing together history was finished. Now began the dangerous public battle for justice. They had all the evidence they needed to prove what happened in the crushing isolation of Station Polaris in 1959. What they couldn't know was how a man who had killed once to protect a secret would react now that his secret was out. The case was built on a foundation of solid, verifiable fact, a chain of evidence stretching across 5 decades. Each link had been forged through meticulous analysis, connecting the pristine crime scene to the man sitting in his mansion on the coast. The scientific method had been used to unravel a scientific crime, leaving no room for doubt or ambiguity. Vance had used the vast impersonal force of the Antarctic to cover his tracks, believing its ice would be a permanent tomb for his secrets. He had counted on the world to accept the simple, dramatic story of man versus nature. It was the perfect crime, concealed by the perfect accomplice. He had just never accounted for the planet changing around him, nor had he accounted for the relentless dedication of a granddaughter who refused to let her family's story be a lie. Eris Thorne had started her journey seeking to understand a myth and had ended up unearthing a murder. The past was no longer a foreign country. It was an active crime scene, and its primary suspect was still at large. The weight of the truth felt heavier than ever. It was one thing to know what happened, to hold the proof in your hands. It was another thing entirely to make the world believe it, especially when the truth implicated a man the world had spent 50 years calling a hero. They had the story, clear and undeniable, from the first argument over the helium-3 deposit to the final chilling sound of the struggle. They had traced the cover-up from the falsified reports to the shell corporation that spirited him away. The timeline was complete. All that remained was the final confrontation. The next step would not be an interview or a quiet presentation of facts. It required a public spectacle, an arena where Vance's reputation could be confronted directly with the voice of the man he murdered. They had to force a reckoning that he could not escape or deny. The path forward was clear, but it was also perilous. Elias Vance had built an empire on his lie, and he would not see it dismantled without a fight. The investigation had provided the ammunition. Now Eris had to prepare for war, knowing that the final battle would not be fought in the sterile environment of a lab, but in the court of public opinion. What they did not know was that the key to Vance's final public undoing was hidden not in the evidence they had already found, but in the very tribute he had established to honor the men he had killed. The strategy was audacious, a calculated gamble designed not for a courtroom, but for a coliseum of public opinion. Investigator Cole secured a keynote speaking invitation for Eris at the Polaris Legacy Foundation's 50th Anniversary Gala, an event established and funded by Elias Vance himself. It was the ultimate stage, a tribute to the lie he had so carefully constructed. Vance, insulated by a lifetime of adoration and convinced of his own untouchable status, graciously accepted his role as the night's guest of honor. He saw it as his final triumphant coronation, as a living legend, completely unaware that he was walking willingly into an ambush designed to be his public execution. Days before the event, driven by a cold, methodical need to see the full scope of his deception, Eris visited the Foundation's permanent museum exhibit. It was a hagiography in glass cases, filled with replicas of equipment and framed photographs of the lost men. In a central display, under soft lighting, was a collection of personal items attributed to Vance's heroic survival. Her breath caught in her throat. There, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a distinctive silver fountain pen with an inlaid mother-of-pearl grip. It was her grandfather's, a gift from her grandmother, an object she had seen in family photos her entire life, the very pen that had been resting on his desk when Station Polaris was sealed. The placard beneath it read, "Dr. Thorne's pen, recovered from Dr. Vance's possession following his rescue, a cherished memento of his lost friend." The lie was so brazen, so arrogant, it was breathtaking. This was no memento, it was a trophy. Vance had not just murdered his colleagues, he had stolen a piece of his primary victim and displayed it as a testament to his own fabricated grief. In that moment, Eris knew she had him. The audio recording was the voice of the crime, but this pen was its tangible, physical soul, an irrefutable link hidden in the most public place imaginable. The night of the gala was a spectacle of academic prestige and somber remembrance. The grand ballroom was filled with the world's leading scientists, influential politicians and journalists, all gathered to honor the myth of Polaris. Elias Vance sat at the head table, a frail but dignified patriarch, accepting the waves of reverence with practiced humility. He took the stage to a standing ovation, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion as he spoke of his dear friend Alistair and the cruel arbitrary power of nature that had taken him and the others. He was magnificent in his deception, a master performer playing his greatest role one final time. Then Aris was introduced. She walked to the podium, the weight of 50 years of silence settling on her shoulders. The room was quiet, expecting a heartfelt tribute from the granddaughter of the expedition's lost leader. She began not with praise, but with a simple observation about the nature of Antarctic ice, how it does not destroy, but preserves, how it keeps secrets locked in a perfect frozen stasis, waiting for the world to be ready for them. A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere, a current of unease rippling through the reverent silence as her tone departed from the expected script. Her voice, amplified through the ballroom, was clear and steady as she systematically dismantled the official narrative. She presented the new climatological data on the main screen, showing the satellite models of a calm and storm-free week in December 1959. Murmurs spread through the audience. She followed with the evidence of the deliberately severed radio wires and the analysis of the ship that had rescued him, a vessel belonging to a shell corporation of Titan Energy. She was not delivering a eulogy. She was reading an indictment, piece by damning piece, laying the foundation for her final, inescapable conclusion. Vance watched from his seat, his gentle smile tightening into a rigid line. His eyes, once full of feigned warmth, now burned with a cold, reptilian fury. He saw his legacy, his entire life's work of lies, being unraveled before the very community he had spent decades manipulating. This was not a scientific presentation. It was a targeted attack, and he was losing control of the narrative for the first time in 50 years. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table as Aris's methodical presentation cornered him, stripping away the layers of his heroic myth with each new piece of evidence. Finally, Aris turned her gaze directly to him, her voice resonating with the authority of absolute truth. The official story required a storm, Dr. Vance, because the truth was far too simple and far too monstrous, she declared. The truth is that Station Polaris was not compromised by a polar vortex. It was compromised by greed. She then gestured to the image of the fountain pen on the screen. You said you kept this as a memento, but how could you have it when my grandfather's quarters were sealed shut, buried under 60 feet of ice, untouched until we opened them last year? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and lethal. The room was utterly silent, every eye shifting between the image on the screen, the old man at the head table, and the unwavering woman at the podium. Vance's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. He started to rise to object, but Aris raised a hand, stopping him. You have told your story for 50 years, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. Now it is my grandfather's turn to speak. In the profound silence, she pressed a button on the laptop. A faint hiss filled the speakers, the sound of static from a world away. Then a voice, young and clear, echoed from the past. It was Alistair Thorne, arguing, his tone filled with righteous anger. He was followed by the cold, dismissive voice of a young Elias Vance, speaking of destiny and the irrelevance of idealists. The audience listened, transfixed and horrified, as the 50-year-old recording played out the final moments of the Polaris I expedition. They were no longer attendees at a gala. They were witnesses at an inquest. The recording reached its horrifying crescendo, the sound of the struggle, a sickening thud, and then the abrupt, chilling silence that followed. The audio file ended, but the silence it left behind was deafening, filled with the collective shock and revulsion of everyone in the room. It was not evidence to be debated. It was a ghost's accusation, delivered across time, irrefutable and absolute. Every person in that ballroom now knew they were in the presence of a murderer. Elias Vance, the hero, the icon, was gone, replaced by the monster on the tape. Vance, a cornered animal, finally broke. He staggered to his feet, his face purple with a rage that erased the frail old man and revealed the ruthless killer beneath. "He would have given it away!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with venomous fury. "To the world, the fool. He saw a gift for humanity. I saw an engine for an empire. That discovery was mine. I earned it. I built this world, while he and the others were nothing but a footnote, frozen in the ice where they belonged." It was a full confession. A torrent of ego and justification screamed into the stunned silence of the room. The dam of his 50-year lie had burst, releasing a flood of pure, unadulterated malice. He admitted everything: the sabotage, the murders of the other 7 men, the prearranged extraction by his corporate partners. He railed against Alistair's idealism, sneering at his belief in shared knowledge. He confessed not with remorse but with pride, outlining the genius of his plan and the decades of prosperity it had brought him. In his final moments of freedom, his arrogance was so complete that he felt the need to make them understand not his guilt, but his superiority. Chaos erupted. Journalists scrambled, their cameras flashing, capturing the historic downfall. Security personnel moved toward the stage as Investigator Cole, who had been waiting in the wings, stepped forward. "Elias Vance," Cole's voice cut through the din, calm and official, "you are under arrest for the murders of the 7 members of the Polaris I expedition." The words sealed Vance's fate, transforming the gala from a celebration of his life into the scene of his final public disgrace. The hero of Polaris was led away in handcuffs, his furious, incoherent protests drowned out by the roar of the truth finally being heard. The aftermath was a global media firestorm. The story of the Polaris conspiracy dominated headlines for months, a shocking tale of scientific betrayal and cold-blooded murder. The full extent of the cover-up, involving Titan Energy and complicit government officials who had accepted the convenient storm narrative, was exposed. The trial was a formality. With his public confession and the mountain of evidence, Vance was swiftly convicted on all counts. He would die in prison, his name forever stripped of honor and rewritten in the annals of history as a monster. The 7 murdered men of the Polaris I expedition were finally given the justice they were denied. Their names were cleared of the implication of incompetence that had always lingered in the shadow of the freak storm narrative. They were reinterred with full honors, no longer martyrs to nature, but recognized as the victims of a heinous crime. Their families, many of whom had gone to their graves with unanswered questions, were given the painful but necessary closure of the truth. Their sacrifice was no longer a mystery, but a clearly understood tragedy of ambition and greed. Eris Thorne stood before a new memorial, a simple granite obelisk etched with the 8 names of the expedition. Her grandfather's name was at the top. She had not only solved a 50-year-old crime, but had also reclaimed her family's legacy from the man who had stolen and perverted it. Her personal quest had rewritten a significant chapter of scientific history, ensuring that the monumental discovery of helium-3 would now be managed by an international consortium, just as Alistair Thorne had always intended. The discovery would benefit the world, not a corporation. She had fulfilled the desperate hope contained in the message her grandfather had left for her. The truth is in the numbers. Polaris is silent. She had deciphered the numbers, and, more importantly, she had broken the silence. The eerie quiet of the abandoned station was replaced by the sound of justice, a resolution that echoed from the frozen heart of Antarctica to the rest of the world. Her journey into the past had been a descent into a cold, dark lie. But she had emerged into the light, carrying the truth with her. The emotional weight of the revelation settled into a quiet, bittersweet peace. The grief for the grandfather she never knew was now tempered with a profound sense of connection and pride. She had been his final message, the instrument of his last will. In uncovering his murder, she had come to know him more intimately than she ever could have through photographs or stories. She had heard his voice, understood his principles, and ultimately she had vindicated his life and his death, bringing his long, cold journey to an end. Justice had been served, but the scars of the deception remained as a cautionary tale. It was a stark reminder of how easily history can be written by the victors, even when that victory is built on a foundation of murder. The Polaris story became a lesson in the importance of questioning accepted narratives, of looking deeper than the convenient heroic myths. The truth had been there all along, perfectly preserved, waiting for someone with the courage to dig it up and expose it to the light. The world now knew the full story. They knew of the monumental discovery that had been suppressed and the idealist who had died protecting it. They knew of the 7 brilliant minds silenced in the desolate cold, their contributions erased by the man they had trusted as their colleague. The Polaris I expedition was no longer a symbol of tragic exploration, but a powerful testament to the enduring conflict between selfless discovery and selfish ambition, a drama that had played out on the world's most isolated stage. For Eris, the journey was over. She had stared into the abyss of her family's past and had not flinched. She had confronted a monster disguised as a hero and had won. The emotional resolution was not one of simple happiness, but of profound and hard-won catharsis. The ghosts of Station Polaris could finally rest, their story told, their silence broken. She had given them back their voices, and in doing so, had found her own. The weight of her grandfather's legacy no longer felt like a burden, but like an honor she had rightfully earned. The ice of Antarctica is a powerful force, a slow-moving river that grinds mountains into dust and buries history under immense pressure. It holds its secrets for millennia, guarding them in a frozen, silent vault. But ice is not eternal. It shifts, it cracks, and it melts. Sooner or later, what is buried will be revealed. The truth, like a body entombed in a glacier, is never truly lost. It simply waits, patient and cold, for the inevitable thaw that will bring it back to the surface.